Hi, and welcome to this edition of Expert Insights webinars. I'm your host, Don McLain, and today's session is focused on tips and tools for writing effective plain language summaries, presented by MMS and TrialAssure. MMS is an innovative, data-focused, and technology-enabled CRO, bringing insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. TrialAssure is a leading award-winning disclosure and transparency technology suite, supporting clinical trial registration, disclosure, data sharing, anonymization, redaction, and plain language summary activities. Here to present today is Kasim McLain and Dr. Michelle Reed. Kasim is Manager of Disclosure Services and an industry-recognized expert in U.S. and EU clinical disclosure regulations and obligations, and she is a former manager and clinical disclosure lead at GSK. Michelle is a medical writer based in Canton, Michigan. Prior to MMS, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where she earned a doctorate of philosophy in immunology. Thanks to our presenters for joining us today. And as a reminder, your microphones will be muted for the duration of this session, and we'll send out a recording following this call. If you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A at any time via the icon at the top right of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer as many of them as we can at the conclusion of this session. With that, I'll turn it over to Kasim McLain. Kasim.
Thanks, Don, and thanks everyone for joining us today to learn more about plain language summaries and the tools that you can use to write these documents more efficiently and effectively. So today we'll focus on how to author these documents rather than the ancillary tasks such as translating these summaries into local languages or distributing the summaries to patients. We'll begin by providing some background into plain language summaries and the regulations that will govern them, and then we'll discuss the unique aspects of the target audience and how writing for this audience is different than writing for regulators and clinicians. Then we'll provide an overview of the authoring process and the key challenges that you may encounter throughout the process and the efficiencies that you can adopt to make the process run more smoothly. And then finally, we'll close out by offering some tips for educating reviewers and making the review process as a whole run more efficiently. So we'll start off with a brief introduction to a plain language summary, what it is, why we write them, and how sponsors are approaching the deliverable. We'll also touch on the regulation that will eventually mandate that these summaries be made publicly available. So a plain language summary is a short and basic description of clinical trial results, and essentially it's a distillation of a highly technical scientific summary into a summary that's geared toward patients and caregivers. So it has to be written in lay or common language that can be easily understood by somebody who reads at a 6th to 8th grade reading level. So a patient may have a nuanced understanding of the condition they're being treated for, but even if they do, they might not be aware of the treatments that are available to them or why the trial they were enrolled in was conducted the way it was. So when writing a plain language summary, it's important to assume that the audience doesn't have the necessary background to understand things like the design of the trial, the data that were collected, or the tests that are being administered. And the plain language summary provides this information in a format that can be easily digested by a person lacking a background in science or medicine, and it essentially returns the patient's information to them. As of now, sponsor companies are writing plain language summaries and making them available to clinical trial participants on a voluntary basis for the most part. Ultimately, plain language summaries will eventually need to be written, and they'll need to be posted publicly to comply with legislation coming out of Europe and the European Union. In 2014, the clinical trials regulation was adopted by the EU and it entered into force. Article 37 of the clinical trials regulation requires that a summary that is understandable to a layperson be made publicly available no later than 1 year after the study completion date in the local language of the EU country in which the trial took place. So this means that a single lay summary will need to be translated into multiple languages depending on where the trial was conducted. The date of application of the clinical trials regulation is dependent upon the availability of the new EU Clinical Trials Information System, or the portal, as you may hear it be called. And this is still under development. Sponsors will need to upload their plain language summaries to this portal, and the requirement to make these summaries publicly available will be mandatory upon portal availability. So currently, the projected CTIS availability date is late 2021. We've most recently heard December 2021. This date has been pushed back several times. They said this is kind of the drop dead date for it going live, but I think it's reasonable to expect that the date could be pushed out further as the EU is dealing with Brexit and the COVID-19 pandemic. So in 2017, the FDA issued a draft guidance on the provision of plain language summaries. A draft guidance represents the FDA's current thinking on a topic, and it's not in any way a binding regulation. So at this time, the FDA does not require that sponsors make a plain language summary of trial results publicly available, but the fact that they publish this guidance on this topic, it should serve as a clue to sponsor companies that legislation could very well be drafted and adopted in the future. So even if a sponsor is not conducting trials in the EU, and they might not need to comply with the legislation requiring plain language summaries to be written, they may want to start thinking about the process and template development in anticipation of the US adopting similar requirements. The EU has published expert group recommendations for how to comply with the clinical trials regulation. And this regulation, remember, mandates that the plain language summaries be written and disseminated. These recommendations contain guidance for improving reader comprehension through adherence to health literacy principles, and a writing style that promotes usability and understandability. Health literacy is the degree to which people are able to obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. So we'll talk more about health literacy and how to cater these summaries to a lay audience in subsequent sections of this webinar. But the guidance contains suggestions such as not using jargon, using short, succinct sentences, and using terms and concepts consistently throughout the summary. The guidance also stresses that the content of the summary should not be promotional in nature and should make no claims of efficacy or superiority. So instead, neutral text should be used. Examples of a neutral text are provided in the guidance, and we'll also cover this more in subsequent sections. Most sponsor companies have developed a template that should be followed when writing these documents. This template contains text that's been agreed upon by all entities of the sponsor company, and following the template ensures that the summaries are written consistently and they're aligned across the therapeutic areas and investigational products. And the guidance document also contains sample templates that contain instructional text and examples of wording for explaining complex concepts. Annex 10 of the clinical trial regulation lays out the 10 key elements that should be included in each plain language summary. These elements are often outlined in a sponsor's template. They include the clinical trial identifier, be it the protocol ID, the title of the trial, the EU trial number, and it also contains the name and contact details of the sponsor. Each plain language summary should outline where and when the trial was conducted, why it was conducted, as well as information regarding the trial population. The number of participants enrolled, the countries in which they were enrolled, the key enrollment criteria that must have been met, and then some basic demographic information about the trial population. The investigational product and disease state under study also needs to be appropriately defined, and the summary needs to contain an overview of the adverse reactions that occurred during the trial and the basic results of the trial. Lastly, the reader should be notified as to whether follow-up trials will be conducted and where they can find additional information on the trial in which they were enrolled. A sponsor's template can contain additional information, but at a minimum, these 10 elements need to be addressed. Okay, so why do we write plain language summaries, and why are they so important? So of course we write plain language summaries and make them publicly available to trial participants because the regulations will eventually mandate that we do so. But a lot of sponsor companies are taking a more proactive, comprehensive approach to transparency because the patients themselves have really pushed them to do so. So 90% of trial participants have said that they want to receive the results of the clinical trial in which they were enrolled, and 68% have said that they wouldn't participate in another trial if the results of the first trial weren't made available. These responses from clinical trial participants echo the sentiment that the public at large has about the pharmaceutical industry and their lack of trust for drug developers. So 58% of the public that was polled have a negative opinion of the industry, and they've ranked it below 24 other industries in terms of how trustworthy they are. So a lot of sponsors have responded to the public's distrust by making a commitment to increase transparency, and part of this increased transparency is the return of trial data to participants by way of a plain language summary. So patients have indicated that it's very important to them that they receive the results of the trial they've participated in, and the public has said that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't inspire trust and is not fully transparent. So what are sponsors doing with this information? So as I mentioned, there's a growing trend toward increased transparency, but there's also a trend toward communicating with the patient as soon as they enroll in the trial, and then throughout the entirety of their participation in the trial. A lot of sponsors are taking the approach of adopting a patient-focused communication plan, and plain language summaries as a single part of this overall plan. So at study start, a sponsor may send out an initial thank you card thanking patients for their participation and their contribution, and this serves to let them know what they can expect to receive in the way of future communications. Then at last subject, last visit, sponsors may want to again thank participants for their participation and let them know when they'll be receiving a plain language summary of the trial results. At database lock, sponsors may elect to let patients know that the results of the specific trial arm to which they were randomized may be disseminated. And then of course, the plain language summary is made available no later than 12 months after study completion. So we've talked about sponsors proactively writing plain language summaries. A lot of these sponsors that have taken this initiative are also interested in applying techniques for writing plain language summaries to other types of patient-facing material. So it's really important to remember that parts of every informed consent form or every clinical study report that are written could potentially end up in a plain language summary. So adopting a patient-centric approach to messaging in patient-facing documents such as the informed consent form, which is largely written at the beginning of a study, can save a lot of time and effort when authoring parts of the plain language summary. So one of the main things to consider when writing the plain language summary is the intended or target audience, and how this audience differs from the audience that you may have prior experience writing for. So as we've said, the plain language summary is a distillation of a more technical summary, and it needs to be easily understood by someone with no prior medical or scientific knowledge of the material. And in general terms, this is someone who reads at a 6th to 8th grade level. Journal articles are generally geared towards scientists and researchers. If you're reading a publication, you presumably have prior knowledge of the indication and treatment under study. Protocols and CSRs are written for regulatory agencies who are making decisions regarding approval. So this audience needs to have a very nuanced understanding of the material. Also, both a peer-reviewed publication and a regulatory document specifically address whether the treatment's safe and effective and whether it's safer or more effective than another treatment that's already available. So by their very nature, they're promotional documents that set out to make claims of superiority. Essentially, the target audience for the first two types of deliverables are highly trained individuals who have in-depth knowledge of scientific and medical topics. A disclosure summary is much more of a public-facing document than a CSR, for example, but it's still geared toward clinicians, and it's thus more technical in nature than a plain language summary. The audience of a plain language summary is a very diverse group of study participants. All may have different levels of clinical understanding and a different scientific background. So in subsequent sections, we'll address how the plain language summary can be geared toward this target audience. So because a plain language summary is a distillation of a more technical result summary, like a CSR, it stands to reason that the messaging in the two documents is somewhat aligned. But because the audiences of the two deliverables and the mission of the two documents is so different, the styles and skills needed to write the two documents really begin to diverge. So I'd like to give you a quick illustration of how the same information is presented across different deliverables. So the CSR lists the primary endpoint as ACR 20 response at week 24. The plain language summary describes the same endpoint as PSA symptom improvement, which is what the ACR 20 is measuring. So in the plain language summary, you can explain the use of ACR 20 at a high level, but the exact method of measurement is less important here when explaining the purpose of the study to patients without a scientific background. So for the plain language summary, an explanation of the primary objective should be provided in lay terms, most likely using bullet points to clearly show what each treatment group received and thus reducing the complexity of the information. When writing for a lay audience versus a professional audience, remember that less is more. When writing a plain language summary, you should use short, succinct sentences, and you should use the active voice, even though the passive voice is used for other types of clinical documents. You also have to learn to be selective and to only include the information that is most pertinent to the patient population. Reducing complexity and successfully identifying which information should be presented is challenging, and we'll provide an overview of the key challenges encountered when writing these summaries in a bit. It can also be challenging to develop patient-friendly language to explain complex concepts. So developing concepts, glossaries, dictionaries of lay terms, and guides outlining program-specific or therapy area-specific conventions can be helpful, and they can be utilized time and time again, and this serves to build efficiencies into the writing process. Again, we'll talk more about how to use these tools a bit later when we provide some tips for authoring these types of documents. So in this section, we'll talk a bit about the key elements of the plain language summary and discuss how these documents are written. Because the plain language summary is such a nuanced deliverable with a very specific audience, there are some defined skills that a plain language summary author must have and must use. So as we've discussed, writing for the lay audience is different than writing for scientists, medical professionals, and health authorities. Plain language summary writers typically have degrees spanning scientific, research, medical fields, and this experience is critical when it's your job to distill a lot of data into a summary that can be easily understood. So authors need to be familiar with clinical, medical, and research terminology, but they also have to have a lot of experience with communicating or working directly with non-scientific and non-medical audiences. So it's important to be able to demonstrate the ability to present scientific information creatively, but factually, of course, and also use the soft skills of being empathetic to the patient audience and always keeping the core value of transparency at the forefront of their authoring. And as with anything, these skills are developed and honed through continuous training. So effective plain language summary authors should have outstanding written communication skills, and they need to have demonstrated experience with interpreting medical and scientific information for lay audiences. So the ability to keep the patient at the center of the communication. It's critical to think about what information is useful to a patient and what they need to know to understand the trial they were enrolled in. Authors also need to have the ability to recognize that less is more and be able to quickly identify what information is most important to include in the plain language summary. For example, this might mean disregarding most of the information in the CSR, which we would never do when working in regulatory documentation. You also need to have the ability to develop or instruct concise graphs or images to convey clear messages to lay audiences. And then, of course, a basic understanding of statistical concepts is key. And now I'll turn it over to Michelle, who will discuss some common challenges with writing these types of summaries for lay audiences.
Thank you, Kasim. So now we will discuss some of the unique challenges that come with writing plain language summaries and provide some examples of the ways that we've addressed these challenges in the past. So as we've mentioned before, there are 4 key aspects of writing plain language summaries that can present challenges to medical writers. In order to effectively communicate the results of the study, these documents need to strike a balance between maintaining accuracy and completeness while also restricting language complexity to effectively communicate to a lay audience. In addition, the use of promotional language needs to be avoided to comply with regulatory guidelines. And finally, it's critical to maintain sensitivity to the patients or caregivers who will ultimately be reading these documents. So it's important to strike a balance between summarizing everything that happened during a study and providing the lay reader with the information that they need or want to know. The challenge is to maintain accuracy in explaining the study without using technical or scientific terms. It's also important to be choosy on what details to include so that the important results of the study don't become lost. So for example, when explaining the mechanism of action of a medication, when writing a lay summary, it may be best to leave out the details on the molecular mechanism of a drug in favor of a high-level cause and effect description of how the drug is thought to work. So this could take the form of explaining that molecule X helps cancer cells grow. The investigational drug blocks molecule X, so it may help slow the growth of cancer cells. Another challenge with preparing plain language summaries is maintaining readability at a US 6th to 8th grade reading level. This isn't something that's intuitive for most medical writers, so we utilize tools during the authoring process to make this much easier. Many sponsors, as we've mentioned, are creating glossaries of medical or scientific words and concepts that are written in lay language. And we'll provide an example of how glossaries can be useful in the next slides. We also take advantage of Microsoft Word readability statistics. These can be a quick way to check the complexity of a document. And it may be helpful to have a document reviewed by an individual who isn't scientifically or medically trained so that they can provide feedback on the flow and comprehensibility of the document. So here's an example of what we encounter when translating medical terms into lay language. When describing different modes of injection, it's simple enough to explain the difference between these different types of injections. But it becomes more difficult to describe the difference between subcutaneous and intradermal injections. We can no longer call subcutaneous an injection under the skin because both are technically injections under the skin. So we would need to find a way to explain subcutaneous and intradermal more accurately. So the way that we resolved this was to modify the description of subcutaneous to injection into the fat under the skin and intradermal to injection just under the skin. So once we've encountered this and this decision is made, these 2 different terms can be added to a glossary of terms so that if we encounter this again in a future plain language summary, these terms can be used again. Another key challenge in writing plain language summaries is avoiding statements that could be seen as promotional. Promotional statements can be subtle, so avoiding them can be made easier by the use of blanket statements, such as the results for any individual could have been better or worse than the overall results of the group. The key is to try to keep statements fact-based and not emotional, but still written in the proper tone for the patient. So to provide some examples, these are examples of promotional and non-promotional ways to write the same information. So in the first example, by using the word only to describe the placebo group response, this could imply that the response of 10% in the placebo group was unacceptable, or that the 40% response of the interventional group was significant. So in order to make this non-promotional, we simply state the percentages without any qualifiers. And in the second example you can see shown, saying even with could be read as saying that the response of people taking drug A made it worth the increased adverse events. The non-promotional version just states that the people who took drug A lived longer and also had more side effects without adding any qualifiers. And finally, using sensitive language is critical when writing a plain language summary. It's important to keep in mind that these documents are written for people who either survived the study or, in the case of many studies, the family members of someone who died during a study. And so it's important to choose language that's compassionate and respectful. This sensitivity is of particular importance when writing pediatric lay summaries because the audience for these documents is typically the parent of a child who participated in the study. So an example of how to use sensitive language is in how to describe deaths that occurred during a study. So it could be seen as insensitive to state that 72 patients died during the study, especially if this was a pediatric study. A more sensitive choice would be to state that 72 patients passed away, or to simply report the number of patients who survived the study instead of the number of patients who died. In addition, one of the ways that lay summaries can be made more lay-friendly is by using graphics to communicate complex information in a more intuitive way. A graphic that shows the design of the study can be helpful, especially if there are many different steps or treatment groups in a study. Graphics also have the potential to mislead or confuse the audience, so they should be made as simple and as clear as possible. This is an area where the creativity of the writer and the graphic designer can come into play by using sequential presentation for timelines, icons, and drawings to show the reader how the study was conducted. Graphics can also be useful in communicating study results. So simple bar graphs or illustrations can be used to present empirical data and patient-reported outcomes, using whole numbers ideally and minimal words. These graphics can help readers better understand and interpret the results of the study and help reinforce the information that we're trying to communicate. So now we'll move on and take a look at some tips for authors. So these are some suggestions and best practices that we implement at MMS to simplify the writing process and try to reduce effort in creating lay summaries. So first and foremost, we always try to consider the patient or the caregiver perspective, as these are the individuals who will eventually read the lay summaries we write. We try to focus on the kind of information a patient or participant would want to know about, and again, minimize information that might seem superfluous. And expertise in writing lay summaries really does come with practice, and it's very much like learning another language or becoming bilingual, particularly for medical writers who are used to writing for a professional audience. Transitioning to writing lay summaries that distill results into simple terms can be challenging at first. This process is very much like translating text into a different language. So it's not only the individual words that are important, but the context and the nuances behind the words as well. And becoming fluent in the language of lay summaries does take time and practice. So one of the aspects of writing lay summaries that can be challenging to writers is becoming comfortable using shorter sentences and describing results on a higher or more general level. We strive to include only information that the reader needs to know, as we've said before, only what they need to know in order to understand the purpose and the outcomes of the clinical trial. And as we mentioned, as authors produce more lay summaries, their proficiency increases. And this includes having a sense of what information should be included, how this information should be phrased, as well as anticipating potential comments that study team members or lay reviewers might have about the document, and modifying the document to address those comments ahead of time. And finally, we encourage authors of lay summaries to do their own clean reads of the document. So this entails setting the document down and coming back to it later with a fresh perspective so that the writer can ensure that the language they've selected actually communicates what they intended it to communicate. The next big thing that we recommend is to take advantage of the many different writing tools that are available to authors of plain language summaries. As we've mentioned many times, one of the more challenging aspects of creating a lay summary is translating preferred terms for adverse events into lay language. This can be particularly difficult when describing several AEs that have very similar meanings. So for example, thrombocytopenia and platelet count decreased. These are two very similar preferred terms for two different medical terms. So we as medical writers maintain general and client-specific glossaries of preferred lay-friendly language for adverse event terms, which ensures consistency across development programs and ultimately reduces the effort required to produce these documents. We also utilize online resources that include medical dictionaries for lay readers, such as some of the ones that are available through the NIH, such as the National Cancer Institute or the NIDDK. And these resources can be particularly helpful in explaining disease states in simple terms. In addition to this, many advocacy groups and other patient-facing organizations also have high-quality websites and literature that can be referenced when trying to find plain language descriptions of disease and treatment options. And finally, we do make use of readability tools that are built into Microsoft Word, such as the Flesch Reading Ease and Flesch Kincaid grade level scores that we discussed earlier. So for the Flesch Reading Ease score, we typically aim for a score of at least 60, and we typically aim for a US 6th to 8th grade reading level for the Flesch Kincaid grade level score. All right, the final thing we're going to get into today is efficiencies in the process. We implement efficiencies that can be adopted at either a program level or an organization level. First, we utilize boilerplate or template language to ensure that standardized language is used across multiple lay summaries and according to the requirements of the sponsor. And this ultimately saves time and effort during both the writing and the review process. As we've discussed, we include glossaries in some of the previous sections, which are useful tools to reduce writing effort and ensure consistency. These glossaries are typically developed with the sponsor to provide standard lay terms that are agreed upon for things such as adverse events or preferred terms, as well as for explanation of key concepts and disease states. We also utilize graphic libraries at MMS to increase efficiency in the production of graphics for lay summaries. This enables elements of previously generated graphics to be reused and produces a consistent look across summaries within the same drug development program. In addition to this, automation is currently a hot topic within medical writing, and there are up-and-coming technologies such as structured content management systems that could be used in the future to increase the efficiency and consistency of plain language summary authorship. Although it should be noted that this will still require well-trained authors to produce these documents. Finally, when we work with sponsors to develop lay summary templates, we try to standardize the types of information reported as much as possible. So this could include questions of adverse event reporting, such as whether to report all causality AEs or just the treatment-related AEs. The endpoint inclusion, such as do we only report primary endpoints, primary and key secondary, or all endpoints, how to describe the study design, and finally, what terminology should be used as a standard? So for example, do we address the reader as a patient or participant? Do we use the word drug? Do we use the word medicine? And establishing these things beforehand and putting them into a template document ultimately increases the efficiency of production of these documents. And finally, we're going to get into the review process. At MMS, we use multiple review types to ensure the quality of our work. The first document review is typically completed by an independent lay review panel, which is a group of individuals who come from non-scientific or non-medical backgrounds. The panel will review the document for readability and ease of understanding, and then make suggestions for how we can improve the document for a lay audience. We strongly recommend that this step be completed prior to sending draft 1 to the sponsor, and the panel may be consulted a second time after sponsor comments are incorporated. In some cases, we also utilize patient review, which is also known as user testing. The user testing process allows us to test the understandability and usability of the lay summary with the target audience. This type of review is typically performed by people who have the condition, their caregivers, or their providers, and can include in-person interviews or electronic methods. The interview process can be time-consuming, as it does involve developing interview questions, recruiting participants, conducting the interview, compiling the results, and then finally writing a recommendations report. So because of this, not every lay summary goes through user testing, but this can be useful when either creating a template or when writing a lay summary for a new therapeutic area. And finally, after lay reviewing and user testing, sponsor review is typically the last step in the review process. We've found that there are some common challenges that tend to occur during this part of the process. For example, the reviewers may not be familiar with lay summaries or understand the rationale for writing them. And they may also lack experience in utilizing lay language to communicate complex concepts. Different reviewers may have conflicting comments or points of view, such as the study clinician and the legal team having suggestions that are at odds with one another. In the previous section, we talked about some of the template elements that are helpful to standardize across programs or sponsors. And we found that these are the same elements that tend to require more discussion during the review process. So we author lay summaries with the expectation that there may be more reviewer discussion around these elements, and also encourage leaving annotations for the team members who will be reviewing the document, explaining the rationale behind which pieces of information are being reported in the document. So we as writers address the challenges during the review process in several ways. First, we establish a threshold for comment review meetings. Typically, this is reserved for comments that are more complex or conflicting and can be addressed more efficiently in a meeting rather than attempting to reconcile via email. We also work with the sponsor to establish a hierarchy or order of review. So this can be done in multiple ways depending on the preference of the sponsor. So for example, some sponsors ask multiple team members to review the first draft of a document and then ask that only the clinician and attorney review and approve the final draft in tandem. And educating the study team is also a very important aspect. Because many reviewers may not be familiar with lay summaries, we recommend holding a kickoff meeting to explain the purpose of lay summaries, provide some guidelines for reviewing this type of document, and to agree upon a timeline. And finally, we gray out or highlight any boilerplate or mandatory template text that has been used in a document so that reviewers can avoid suggesting changes to this language. So in conclusion, we would like to thank you for joining us today to learn more about how to effectively author plain language summaries. Lay summaries are important because they not only increase transparency within the industry, but they also enhance patient knowledge about clinical trials. Lay summaries are unique documents and they have a unique set of challenges, but they also provide a rare opportunity to write creatively and to write for the patients that we ultimately serve. So with that said, we'd now like to open up the discussion to any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Kasim, for your insights. Yes, we would like to move on to the Q&A. We do have a few questions so far. As we're going through these, if anyone else has additional questions, please feel free to submit. Just look for the question mark icon and submit directly through there. The first question is for Kasim. How much and what type of training do you think is necessary to be able to identify promotional language?
Yeah, thanks, Don. I think as with writing any kind of document, particularly a scientific document, the more you write, the better you become. So I think, a lot of training is in the writing, but I think you can also build some efficiencies into that training by, we mentioned a lot about keeping glossaries of terms and dictionaries. You can also keep training decks that display what promotional language looks like and how text can be revised to be non-promotional. So seeing that text side by side is particularly helpful, and just having examples that the writer can fall back on. Also doing a clean read, like Michelle said, after you've written a document, reread it from the patient perspective and think, if I read this statement, does it sound like one drug is being promoted over another, or that something is guaranteed to be safe, etc.?
Okay, all right, thank you for that explanation. The next question is for Dr. Reed. Michelle, do you think that automation can be used to write an effective plain language summary?
Thank you, Don. That's an interesting question. So automation is now really being leveraged for many different types of clinical trial documents. And I think that it does have the potential to be a useful tool for creating plain language summaries, particularly by standardizing information across studies, within a drug program, or in a specified therapeutic area. But ultimately, a skilled medical writer is still going to be needed to ensure that concepts that are laid out in standardized language are described adequately and accurately for each study, and to also ensure that the language that is used is sensitive to the intended patient population. So I think automation can be used effectively to increase efficiency and consistency in preparing these summaries, but human touch is still necessary to make sure the documents fulfill their purpose of properly communicating with patients and caregivers.
Okay, wonderful. We have one more question thus far, unless anyone else has an additional question to submit. Last question, when in the process of study reporting are plain language summaries written? Such as, are they written alongside the CSR or after the CSR has been finalized?
So I can take that question. So the upcoming EU requirement for plain language summaries is that these documents be posted 12 months after last subject, last visit. So many sponsors are building authorship of plain language summaries into their existing CSR timelines or basic results, just general clinical trial documentation timelines. And it may be best if time allows to begin writing the plain language summary after the CSR is finalized, but under tight timelines, it may be necessary for the author of a plain language summary to work directly with the CSR author to prepare the plain language summary alongside the CSR in order to meet that deadline.
Okay. All right, perfect. If there's no other questions, if anyone has additional questions on what they heard today, please follow up with your point of contact directly or email media@mmsholdings.com and we'll direct you to a presenter. For additional free webinars, visit mmsholdings.com/webinars or follow MMS and TrialAssure on LinkedIn for updates. Thank you very much for listening and enjoy your day.